Hi, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. It looks like we still have a handful of folks trickling in, so just hang tight for another minute and we'll go ahead and get started. All right, well, we have a lot to cover today. Definitely want to make sure we have enough time for Q&A, so let's dive right in. Good afternoon, and welcome again to today's webinar on climate communications. This webinar is organized by the Statewide Energy Efficiency Collaborative in partnership with ecoAmerica and their Path to Positive Communities program. And this is part one of a two-part webinar series, and we'll share more info at the end about the second webinar. And everyone who's registered for this one is also registered for the second webinar, so we hope that you're able to join us again in November. My name is Julia Kim. I'm a project manager here at the Local Government Commission, one of 3 collaborative NGO partners with the Statewide Energy Efficiency Collaborative, or SEEC, and I will be moderating this webinar. So a quick overview of today's agenda. I'll first provide a brief intro to SEEC for those of you who may not be familiar with the program, then go over some webinar logistics, and then on to our featured presentation. So again, this is part one of a two-part series. This first one will cover how social movements in America grow and succeed, and how American values shape people's perceptions and attitudes of the climate issue and debate. And then we'll wrap up with audience Q&A. So SEEC is an alliance between 3 statewide NGOs, ICLEI, Institute for Local Government, or ILG, and the Local Government Commission, or LGC, as well as California's 4 investor-owned utilities. And together we support local governments in their efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and save energy. And we do this through a number of different resources and services, such as ICLEI's ClearPath tools, ILG's Beacon Recognition and Best Practice Program, LGC's annual SEEC Forum, as well as various workshops, webinars, fact sheets, and templates. And all of these resources are available to local governments at no cost. And we definitely encourage you to get in contact with us if there are targeted resources that you're hoping to get. And we also have the Best Practices Coordinator, who is Kerry Garcia, and he provides some additional hands-on technical assistance to local government staff. And just to highlight a couple of new resources, we recently launched a new learning portal, and we invite you to register through the californiaseek.org website. And we also developed a legislative fact sheet that highlights key climate and energy bills that were signed into law this year. And in the webinar follow-up email, I'll be sure to include links and additional opportunities for you to check out. So before we get started, just wanted to go over a few logistics. Everyone will be muted except for our panelists. And due to the large number of participants, we ask that you type your question into the question box. And please feel free to submit questions at any point during the webinar. We'll be summarizing those questions during the Q&A portion, which will follow the presentation. And any questions that we don't get to, we'll ask our presenter to share responses and share that with you in the webinar follow-up email. This webinar will also be recorded and made available on our website, along with the PDF version of today's presentation. So we definitely encourage you to share this out to your colleagues and other partners. And again, we have our part 2 webinar coming up next month. And I'm excited to introduce our presenter. Dan Barry brings 30 years of environmental campaigning and local government service to Path to Positive Communities, a program that he directs to amplify support for local climate mitigation and resilience efforts through partnerships with trusted institutions that bring together local leaders across key community sectors and provides engagement strategy and content design to broaden public support for local policies and programs. Prior to joining ecoAmerica, Dan served as a senior climate policy analyst for the District of Columbia Department of the Environment's Office of Policy and Sustainability, where he advanced climate mitigation and preparedness plans for the nation's capital and created sector-based sustainability pledges. And prior to that, Dan worked for 25 years with local, state, national, and international environmental advocacy organizations. Thanks so much for being with us here today, Dan, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you for that nice introduction. Now let me figure out how to share my screen. Here we go. And there. Let me know if you are able to see the title slide here. Julie, do you have screen?
Yeah, it looks like you might be showing your second screen. If you wanted to look in the control panel and make sure you're showing your main screen.
Okay, great.
Okay.
It says main screen.
Maybe try the second screen.
Okay, let's try this. All right, hold on. How's that look?
Perfect. Thanks so much, Dan. And thanks everyone for hanging on with us through this. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, yeah, today we're going to go through the first part of a two-part series here that will focus on mostly on a lot of the research that ecoAmerica has done to build a greater sense of literacy and engagement among communications professionals within local governments, but also, as you'll find out, across other key sectors in the United States. Our approach really is to try to build, we provide programs and resources to elevate leadership. We're hoping over the course of the coming years, we can play a role in shifting the national narrative around climate solutions and build towards a collective impact nationally and internationally. Right now, as we all know, most of the work that is happening is happening in local governments around this country and in other countries. And we're hoping that we can build enough social support for climate solutions over time that will be able to eventually lead to a national solution. I won't tell you anything more about myself. Julia did a great job of doing that. I will just say I'm very happy to be here. I love working with local governments. I really appreciate this opportunity. Let's see. There we go. Okay, a little bit more about ecoAmerica. We, as I said, work in three main community sectors. I work with local government, and I have a colleague that works in the faith community, and another colleague that works in public health and in private health. Our structure essentially is to build leadership circles in each of these sectors, build institutional partnerships, provide those partnerships with programs that include communications, guidance, and values research. We do a significant amount of polling. We use other people's polls to help direct the communications and engagement work that we do. And we convene leaders on the national level and increasingly on the local level as well. Just a brief glimpse at our Climate for Health program. You can see we've got partnerships with really quite a great selection of national associations. This, by extension, gives us access to almost 1.5 million health professionals. Our goal, again, is to educate them on how to communicate and lead on climate, as well as to encourage them to visibly speak out and express a desire to solve climate problems for the benefit of public health and personal health. Through our faith program, we've reached almost 85,000 congregations that have a reach of about 23.5 million people around the country. And you can see here a selection of some of the major faith denominations that we're working with. And in my program, in addition to partnerships with Local Government Commission, we're also working with the groups that you see listed here: NLC, Urban Sustainability Directors Network, ICLEI, and others. And I do want to note on the bottom of this slide, we are working on community-wide programs in Los Angeles, where we've been for 3 years, and also statewide in Utah. This is an opportunity for me to try to test our theory and practice, the arts and sciences of communications and engagement, in a real-life setting. And those learnings will help to inform the work we do in other communities this year, next year, and for the foreseeable future. The problem we're here to address as activists and as leaders is summed up by this comic. It's this cartoon sort of, expresses how we're not reaching the general population of the American public around climate solutions. There are reasons for this. There are things that we can learn to do better, and that's hopefully what part of what you'll learn today through this presentation. And when you come back in a few weeks for part 2, we'll give you even some more practical skills on communications and engagement. But we got to get people coming to see our movie, so to speak, in order to embrace climate solutions that are beneficial to them. As I said, we do a lot of, we check in with a lot of polls. This one I like to show, it's, I believe, the Pew survey from almost a year ago. And you see how climate change, way on the right side here, typically is, registers at a low rate of concern among Americans. You can also see from this that that has changed over the last couple of years, that people really are starting to change their perspective on climate change, but it's a complicated picture. It's still not a strong enough level of concern for it to amount to a broad social concern, and that's really what our campaign and what the participation of many of our partners is aiming to achieve, is to raise the level of concern and awareness to the point where people are willing to talk about solutions, engage with others about solving energy, sustainability, and climate problems, and begin to affect real change. Here are a couple of other things that, that you may have seen. So here's a map, and this is from the Yale program on climate change communications, along with George Mason. They do excellent polling, and we work with them pretty closely. So, when you look at the map, the color map, the heat map, if you will, of the percent of adults who think humans are causing the Earth to warm, it's a mixed bag. The bluer colors, of course, being a lower response rate. When you look at the adults who think that scientists agree on the causes for climate change, there's even less of a sense of agreement. People are confused about the science, and this is part of what we'll talk about later, why science is not necessarily the best topic for us to begin our conversations with, at the very least, because there is such confusion, and that's in part on purpose. The people that work against us know this as well as we do, and use this fact to confuse people and to drive people out of the conversation. Gets a lot warmer when you poll for whether people think that there are smart ways to fix global warming. There's a sense in this country that we can solve this problem, even if we don't 100% agree on what the causes are, or if, according to this next map, it gets a lot colder. People don't talk about climate change. They don't talk about global warming. It is a complicated topic. It doesn't naturally come up in conversation, although there are many, many opportunities for us to bring it up in conversation if we think about how to do it in a positive and constructive way. Why don't people talk about climate change? Well, here on slide 13, motivated avoidance has many, many forms. People are afraid. There is something called confirmation bias, where people tend to believe what they already believe. There's also something called techno-optimism. There is a sense in this country, and perhaps elsewhere, that we can find a technological fix for this problem, so I don't really have to weigh in and do anything myself. Naturally, people tend to avoid conflict. There are competing priorities. We all have lives to lead. And for most people in this country, working on climate change or in local government is not their top priority. There are also social norms, and we'll talk a little bit about that too when we explore some of our research on American climate values. And troublingly, there is also a sense of fatalism and resignation. When we talk about a global problem that seems so intractable, if we're not careful, we'll draw people out of the conversation by supporting the sense that there's nothing they can do about this. So these next couple of slides are meant to be intentionally provocative, because we have a long history of communications on climate change, and unfortunately a lot of the messaging has been alarmist and hasn't really approached people on a personal level. So when you say something like, we've been warning you about climate change for years and you or we have done too little to stop it, what might they draw from that? Perhaps it's their fault for not listening. Or when we assert that the scientists all agree that this is happening, an ordinary person may get this message: you're ignorant if you don't agree. And we don't want to draw people out of, or force people out of the conversation by making them feel ignorant. If we don't stop burning fossil fuels, we can't stop this from happening. You must abandon your way of life to save the planet. Messages of scarcity or sacrifice do not work when you're talking about solving these problems. And that's something that I'll show you in a minute in our research. And finally, weather disasters are going to keep getting worse. It's too late, you blew it, and we're all going to die. This is that sense of fatalism. So we have to be careful about these frames and figure out what frames and what message content we can move into. And there has been an evolution in climate messaging. Years ago, we did talk about Armageddon. We talked about global warming in terms of ice flows and polar bears and global destruction. And it really did not bring more people to the conversation. In fact, it really only worked with the 15 or 13% of people who already belong to conservation and environmental groups. That was our core audience, and we've got to move beyond that. We did move into a period of talking about the social benefits, the green jobs, and the opportunities around solving climate change. And that broadened our conversation quite a bit more. But honestly, not that many people we have found have gotten a green job in the solar or wind industry. There's a lot of opportunities that has yet to be realized in the American public. So that base was not that much broader than the environmentalist base. So we're moving now into a period of talking about the personal relevance of climate change and climate change impacts, the solutions and impacts. And we want to talk about impacts and opportunities for families and about our freedom. These are the sorts of frames that we're beginning to move into. And this is a common theme among social movements, that an evolution of frames has helped to move the conversation along and broaden the conversation over time. That's when social movements really take hold and begin to develop social norms that help us support the solutions we seek. Very briefly, we do a ton of research here. I invite you to explore it. It's all for free. You can download PDFs. We have done a climate values study about every other year since about 2006, I think. In fact, we're in the middle of doing one right now to update the most recent report that I'll be drawing on in a few minutes from 2014. But we also do topical research around health and around faith, and we do guidance that helps communicators and others figure out how to more effectively have a conversation or a press conference or write a blog post or update your web content, to use frames that are constructive and inclusionary, and use message content that achieves the same goals. Our methodology starts with doing meta-analysis. We look at the polls, we digest the polls, we analyze trends that we see happening. We've used focus groups, which many of you are probably familiar with, a very good tool for refining the direction we want to go in terms of the research that we do. We do online dial tests that test messages in real time. When you read a message to someone and they dial up or down, depending on how it strikes them. And we also conduct national phone surveys in order to get the research that we use to put into our guidance. And really the original foundation of our research was about exploring American climate values. And why values? The reason that we look at American values, climate values, is that we understand from research that people's core values are established early and they don't change very much or quickly. And what that means is it's not our job to challenge anyone's values or change them. We've got to figure out how to do our job in the context of other people's pre-existing values. We must appeal to values that someone already has. Values do change over time, but we're not going to do that. It's not our role to do that. We know that people make choices based on their core personal values, and we know that large-scale social change requires changes in core personal values that happen over time. I had hoped to spend more time talking about the evolution of certain social movements, but I'll use one example. Marriage equality started about personal rights and the right for people who are gay and lesbian to exercise their freedom. It didn't appeal to very many people outside of that community, and over time we managed to move core values to talk more and more about the right of people to marry whomever they love and choose to spend their life with. Everybody understands that, and so it ended up converting that conversation from being about what was perceived as a special interest to a broad social interest, the right to marry who you love. And while it took a long time to do that, it eventually succeeded to the point where we've seen tremendous progress on that issue. There are other issues that we've studied like that, social change movements that have followed this similar track. But essentially what we're doing is appealing to people's values and trying to make our solutions make sense to them. Again, why values? The same way that climate influences weather, our values influence our opinions, and as communicators, we need to construct frames that then inform the message content that we use in our work. I want to quickly run through some of the top-line findings of our climate values research that we did in 2014. There's a sense of exceptionalism and compassion among Americans. These are statements that were agreed to by people that we polled in this research report. 94% said we can all make small steps to make the world better. 90% said people can be the solution. And again, this is about climate. And 86% agreed that compassion for those who are suffering is an American value that they subscribe to. When we talked about personal rights to a clean environment, broadly supported by people, 84% agree that clean drinking water is a right, that clean air is a right, roughly the same, 83%. 79% of people believe that a safe neighborhood free of toxics is a right that they have as a citizen of this country, and a similar number agreed that access to natural spaces and parks is an American value, an American right. And digging a little bit further down, there is a sense of responsibility. 81% think that companies that pollute are responsible for doing something about climate change. 78% back then agreed that the EPA has a role to play. And 75% said me. I, as an individual, have a role to play in solving this problem. Now, as I mentioned, we're in the process of updating this research. It'll be very interesting for us to see how some of these values have changed over time, especially as we all know, given that other polling that's more recent is showing much greater interest, much greater awareness, much greater concern on the part of the American public with respect to climate change. This is a situational awareness that I think we can all point to in our particular regions, is driven by events that were unplanned and that people are vastly aware of happening, and I think the connections are being made. So some of the top climate values findings that I want to go through here, and I'm going to give you the headlines. Americans follow their tribes. Americans won't abandon the American dream. My family first means that we have competing priorities. When it comes to solutions, one size does not fit all. Showing benefits are essential to action. I want to talk about the curse of techno-optimism, which I mentioned before. There is a sense that climate action is an elite and alienating focus. And as I just touched on, emerging connections are still emerging. 3 years ago, those connections were still emerging. They still are, but I think we're seeing a rapid uptick in the connections people are making between climate and the impacts they feel in their daily lives. So let's go to the first one first. Americans follow their tribes, and they're afraid to stray. Our research found that people generally rely on views from trusted tribal leaders. It's members of their family, their faith, political party leaders. We've seen the stark lines that show up in poll after poll on partisan beliefs and belief in climate change. Even cultural and social influences like TV shows and if you're a Fox watcher versus a CNN watcher. These are things that we can sort of use to assess people's values. If people's tribes don't support climate action, they won't support climate action. Looks like there's a typo there. Americans trust leaders in their daily lives, and they look to them for guidance. And this is, again, why in our program we're working with people like you and people who are in the faith and healthcare industries, because we want to increase the number of people who touch ordinary citizens, the 75% of us that are persuadable about climate change and climate solutions. We want to increase the influence that trusted leaders are having on their flocks, their constituents, their patients, their members. Largely, though, as I mentioned before, environmentalists are not a part of most people's tribe. We are in the minority, those of us who consider ourselves environmentalists. So what can we learn from this set of findings? The learnings that we have are that in order to communicate, we have to form lasting collaborations with groups of leaders that actually do have those connections with Americans that we seek to move into. We've got to empower them with whatever resources we can, including the confidence that they can speak and lead by example. Whether it's leading by example by making changes and choices within their own practices, that's an important first step. But part of it is that not only do we want people to lead by example, we want them to engage others to do the same. So the communications aspect is an important facet of this as well. If you connect with the solutions and you personalize them and share that with the people you're close with, it's much more likely as a tribal member, as a member of that group that you associate with, that your friends and colleagues and family members will follow suit. They'll feel like it's safe for them to also express concern and participate in solutions. Okay, this next one gets us every time we look at Kathy Lee Gifford, I think that is, or who? No, that's Kelly Ripa. I shop, therefore I am. Americans truly subscribe to the value of the American dream. There is a sense of upward mobility and status seeking that is really deeply ingrained in our culture. And when we approach ordinary Americans with a message that talks about sacrifice or doing with less, we lose the conversation. And all of this is about starting a conversation and keeping our audience. So anything we do, like saying you have to do with less, so you have to give up your way of life, whenever we approach a conversation from that perspective, we lose our audience, and we have to avoid doing that. There is a keep up with the Jones mentality, and people do work hard to achieve things. They feel that they've earned the right to have things, and if we approach them again saying you don't have the right to have that or you need to get rid of it, we're going to alienate them. So what we can learn from this is that messages like the story of stuff don't resonate, that we have to emphasize things that aren't new or not ask people to make radical changes. There need to be extrinsic motivations that we bring to people in our solutions. We have to talk about the rewards for good and for avoiding bad. So can you save money? Can you improve your community health, your personal health? What are the solutions we're offering you, and what are the benefits that they can provide you as an individual, as a leader of your family, as a leader in your community? People are followers. Again, this is that tribal thing that we just talked about. People want to be a part of the tribe, and they seek their identity through that tribe. My family first. This is really, we don't have to spend a lot of time here. I think we can all identify with this. This is not a uniquely American value, but people do care about making sure that their family is provided for. That's a value that we can really use to our benefit. And the way we have to use that to our benefit is to find solutions that help people feel that they are providing a healthy environment and a secure future for their family. Smart and responsible solutions, protection of the family, the household, the community. These are things that resonate with people on a fairly deep level. And it, again, provides us with an excellent platform from which to start a conversation that leads to our goal, how to do solutions, how to do energy, climate, and sustainability solutions within our community that benefit everybody. And benefits are essential for action. This is another core finding that is really important. We can't just talk about the problem without talking about the benefits of the solutions we propose. And there really is a very firm and direct correlation between the belief in climate change and the belief in benefits. And what that means is people are much more likely to believe that this is a problem they can solve if they understand that there are benefits in the solutions. Mainstream Americans aren't seeing those benefits, at least at the time that this report was done. It's possible that that's starting to happen more as more and more local governments and organizations are embracing sustainability solutions and energy and climate solutions. But that's still a case that we need as leaders to prove to our audiences. A lot of people think, again, that they're going to be negatively impacted by the solutions, that it's going to mean less energy for them or less resources, fewer resources, less wealth, fewer choices and options, when in fact, it's easy for us to provide evidence to the contrary. And there's also not really penalties that people are feeling, although some of the weather events that we're starting to see may have changed that. Again, we'll learn a lot in the next few months as we start to release some findings from our current study. So what do? As communicators and leaders, emphasize real solutions that have personally relevant benefits. Connect climate solutions with the benefits for their pocketbooks, for their health, and for the vitality of their community, whether it's economic or social or environmental vitality. These are all important elements of vitality that we can talk about on the community level. And that allows us to to show in a very demonstrable way how taking the right actions right now will benefit them, their quality of life, and their ability to lead a positive, fulfilling life in their community and for their family. Techno-optimism. There are an increasing number of technological fixes that are coming to the fore, and those are very important. When you look at the three critical elements of sustainability, energy, and climate solutions, there are policies that we need to put in place, and that's what groups like LGC and its members are doing. Many of those policies force technology or rely on technology, and so there is a role for technology. The other part of solutions is what we're talking about now, how to engage people on how to move communities forward. The problem with techno-optimism, though, is that we have a strong affinity for the American can-do-it technological sense that we can build something, design something, engineer something that will fix this problem. As a people that value ingenuity and innovation, this is a strongly held core value, and it's a good one as long as it doesn't allow us to blow off the need for us to be personally responsible, to look for other forms of solutions that may not be a technological fix. So how we use this is that we emphasize that American leadership and innovation is an important part of this, but it's only a part of it. We can get clean energy, and there are many, many more options out there for clean and renewable energy. It's at a much more affordable price, and that price is improving. We talk about all of the above for solutions by co-opting the all of above energy phrasing that is used by folks who are trying to hold on to fossil fuels and downplay the role of renewables and green technology. There is an all of the above approach to solutions. We should include technological advances as an opportunity for us to reduce our impact, even if it's not going to solve it entirely, and really show how, as technology unfolds, there are little and big ways that Americans can take part in it, whether it's retrofitting light bulbs or buying green power, which many, many people have access to do simply by making a phone call or going on a website. So we can flip the techno-optimism into action instead of allowing it to breed a sense of resignation. Climate action is elite and alienating. And this is a hard one for many of us to really accept. I've been active on climate issues for 30 years. The first conference I organized was in 1987. And the conversation was much, much more narrow then than it is now even. But it was pretty much policymakers and environmentalists who were talking about climate change then. And to a large extent, it's still us. And ordinary Americans look at the political elite or scientists or environmental activists as people who are in a position of power and privilege, people that are effete and not connected with them, people that may be out of touch with reality. And these are beliefs that are impossible to disprove, and so we have to sort of embrace the fact that we may not be the best messengers in all instances to talk about climate solutions. The images that you see here, there's Al Gore depicted as a saint, and when Secretary Kerry ripped climate change deniers as flat earthers, or Rolling Stone calls out people who don't believe in climate change or are unsure about it as you idiots, or calling people stupid. One of the things that we have to be very careful about is, and in our part 2, we'll talk more specifically about engagement techniques and communications techniques that don't, again, eliminate or draw the audience away from us by claiming that they're ignorant or stupid. Nobody likes to be called stupid, and unfortunately, a lot of the framing that we've come up with historically around climate and energy and sustainability has come off as alienating. And the way we fix that is that, if we want people to lean in with us and care about climate, we've got to find the right messengers. If we're not the right messengers, and we're not always the wrong messengers, it's important to know your audience at all times, but there we're finding that there are really effective messengers from other sectors of community life that gain audience share, if you want to look at it from that perspective, that gain an audience that we don't have access to because of this sense that we're not the same. Environmentalists and even policymakers are an elite class that doesn't understand ordinary people. So that's part of the reason why, as I mentioned before, we work with faith and health leaders, and why, as local leaders, you probably do too. I think that's a common sense approach, that the more voices and the more broad array of voices you can bring into your local conversation, the more likely you're going to influence people, gain their trust and appreciation, and begin to move towards the solutions that you have in place. So the last one I think here is that emerging connections are still emerging. Our polling and research found that at the time, most Americans weren't really making the connections between climate change and health impacts, or climate change and weather impacts. 3 years is a long time, and we all know that these have been a momentous 3 years. So that's part of the reason why we've been doing so much work to engage health professionals and to equip them with additional research, not health research, but communications research, engagement research, to bolster their ability and their interest in speaking out on climate change. And just as an aside, next week, the American Public Health Association is having their annual conference in Atlanta, Georgia. We first started working with them about 2 or 3 years ago, and if you looked at their website from that time, you couldn't really find climate change as a public health issue on the main website of the American Public Health Association's, in terms of their programs and research. Their annual meeting had maybe 1 or 2 sessions out of hundreds and hundreds of sessions that talked about climate change and the impacts around climate change. This year, next week, the annual meeting of the American Public Health Association is going to be entirely about the year of climate and health. There will be several hundred sessions led by qualified public health professionals and others talking about the nexus of health impacts, and climate change. So the awareness is growing, and our mission, again, is to get that beyond the professional associations in public health and healthcare, beyond the associations of faith leaders, and into a broader conversation. So the findings from this, the connections are still emerging. We still need to do more. We're all working as hard as we can, but we've got to help to make the climate and health and climate and weather connection. We've got to do it in a way that, again, is about the personal impacts from these connections, not about doom and gloom or scaring people about weather impacts that we're anticipating will increase in severity. It's about being prepared. It's about being informed about what you can do. The best way to do that, obviously, and there are many opportunities to do this, is to use local examples and visual comparisons. People that, bringing out examples that people have experienced, are likely to have experienced or clearly did in their community. Again, we can talk about the wildfires that devastated communities across California. We can talk about severe weather in the Southeast and how communities are still recovering from that. While we also still have to be careful not to say climate change caused that disaster, scientists and policy makers are increasingly comfortable saying, no, it may not have caused that particular event, but it certainly contributed to the severity. And again, on a scientific level, that's a little too remote and too rarefied. If you say it contributed to the severity, we can see how that's showing up in our communities in California. You may be able to open a conversation that allows people to participate in it using their own experience, using the experience of someone they know or love that went through something. Again, another way to appeal to people's personal relevance around these issues. And there are many, many trends and events that we can use, comparing snowpack from years past to snowpack that we're typically seeing now. Comparing, in New England, the first frost and the last frost. These sorts of things are are known to people in those areas. They are part of the common lore, they're part of common knowledge, and when you start to compare not only extreme events, but trends that are also discernible and observable, then you can begin a conversation that's local and personal, not global and scientific. Here are a couple of pages of summary recommendations that I just want to go through that we've been sharing with people since this research came out, and they really do apply still today, years later. And you know, basically our first cardinal rule is focus on people. We say start with people, stay with people. If you're having a conversation with a person, you want to talk about them, you want to talk about their personally relevant reality versus technology, policy, and the planet. You can have those conversations, but you don't start there. What you want to do is start with the personally relevant issues, and then you can, you know, as the conversation or presentation progresses, you can talk about policy or technological ideas that you know are valid and have relevance. You can talk about planetary impacts if that's something that makes sense. Rather than engage individuals on a one at a time basis, there are groups within your communities that are doing good climate work, and they may not only be environmental groups. There could be business groups, there could be faith groups and public health groups. There are other entities in virtually every community that are beginning to organize their ideas about how to save money on energy, how to make the world a better place, make the community a better place, but also how to reach people within their association or their group. And by empowering these local leaders and working with them, we form greater numbers of connections that help to elevate the conversation within the community. We can't ignore that each and every one of us have competing priorities, some of the other biases that we talked about earlier. And so it really helps to understand and appreciate and incorporate people's everyday concerns when you're talking about climate impacts, real or anticipated, but most importantly also climate solutions. We know that, you know, not every solution is going to put money in someone's pocketbook or make their community a green oasis overnight, but there are many benefits that we can emphasize that help to alleviate everyday concerns that people might have. If we can make those connections, that should be our starting point. And that goes along with emphasizing solutions, the benefits, and the success that's already happening. I'm a little bit of a sustainability nerd. When I walk around Washington, D.C., or almost any community, I have an ability to point out sustainability features. There are co-benefits to planting a tree. There are co-benefits to enlarging the tree box that tree is planted in, or to putting in bike lanes, or to putting in a bike share system, or a rapid transit system. So when you start to see how these solutions are being put in place in your community, it gives you something specific to point to and talk about how it's benefiting the community, it's benefiting the individual or the group of individuals you're talking with. We found that it's helpful to deliver positions that are bold and effective, again, because Americans believe in entrepreneurial solutions, in technological solutions. There's a sense that bold action is valuable and is sort of part of the American way. So don't be afraid to talk about bold choices that have efficacy when you're talking about your local climate solutions and the policies and programs you're putting in place. And it obviously is important that those solutions and their efficacy be tied to relevant reality, the local reality, not science, not global or national policies, but what's happening in that community. We always suggest, and this is a kind of a communications 101 cardinal rule, is that you always end with an ask. If you're making a presentation or a speech or even in an article, you want to make an appeal, but you want to make sure that it's something that you can do, that one can do. So it's never helpful to just point out the problems and the risks without also pairing that with tangible benefits that are appealing, that are attractive, and that are relevant and can actually take place within the community. Again, we're finding that the climate health and the climate weather connections are getting a lot of people's attention. While we hate to take advantage of people's suffering, there's certainly enough suffering out there that underlines the importance of the work we're doing. And the awareness is growing among ordinary people about what's happening in our country and around the world, but most importantly in their own community in many cases. And again, our solution shouldn't necessarily be this is new or this is a change we're asking you to make. Certainly not a sacrifice, and sometimes those, a change is equated with making a sacrifice. Every solution you frame really has to emphasize the personal benefit and the family values that will accrue to the community or the individual. I want to just give you a brief preview of part 2 that I believe is scheduled for the 21st of November. We have turned this research into practical guidance, and we'll spend a lot more time in 3 weeks talking about that guidance. We have a guide called the 15 Steps to Climate Communications, and we also are doing a lot more work on practical guidance around positive and constructive local engagement. And we'll talk a lot more about that when we get together the next time. But as a preview, and this is again available on our webpage if you want to take a sneak peek, it's a very thin volume called the 15 Steps. And it follows a sequence that our research with our pollsters and linguists and campaign professionals actually makes sense. The first 10 steps are really important to get in sequence. So start with people, stay with people. I already mentioned that. Connect on common values. So the more you can understand your audience's core values, the better you can connect with them. Acknowledging ambivalence, I also mentioned. Allow people to be doubtful. Allow them to have doubts and questions and not be 100% convinced, because you don't want to alienate them and push them out of the conversation by making them feel stupid. And by making it real, that's what we were just talking about. Locally relevant examples that people can know that they've experienced, or they can draw upon to help them get a sense of what you mean by climate risk or impacts, what you mean by climate solutions, and the benefits that come from them. We also always want to emphasize solutions. Our conversations or our communications should be inspiring and empowering. We don't want to have doom and gloom, as point number 12 points out. Focus on the personal benefits, end with an ask. Doing these steps in sequence, again, we've proven matters. If you put them out of sequence, then people are getting sort of a clear sense of why you're talking to them, what the problem is, and what you want them to do about it, or what you hope they will do about it. We prefer that our communications don't label, but that they describe things, and we'll go into more detail about that. And then these final 5 points are really means that we've researched that help to strengthen the core message that you might bring to a communications that you're doing. We have another report available on our website called Let's Talk Climate. I won't go into all of this stuff here, but while you're looking at slide 48, we have specific recommendations, specific language that we've tested that we found to be more effective than some of the tried and true or tried and not so true language that we typically have used as communicators in the past. So rather than talk about climate change, we talk about damage to the climate. And to you and I, as professionals, that may seem like an insignificant difference, but to an ordinary member of an audience that we're speaking to, the 75% of people that we need to reach who are neither environmentalists already or the corresponding 13 to 15% of people who just don't believe climate change is a real thing that they need to be concerned about. The people in the middle are our core audience, and these slight phrasing differences do make a difference to them. So we don't talk about the planet or polar bears, we talk about families, our children, future generations. These are ideas and values that resonate much more strongly. We don't talk about dirty energy or fossil fuel energy. We, again, want to avoid jargon or technical language at all costs. Fossil fuel energy is something that may not make sense to people the same way sustainability may not. So instead, we talk about dirty fuels, out-of-date fuels, outdated fuels, things that put the future in perspective and frame fossil fuels and polluting fuels as something of the past. And we'll go much more into detail on that as well, and review some of the research that went into that. And just a couple more slides. When it comes to community engagement, a few tips that we'll go into more detail about. Number one, strengthen social networks. So as activists and as communicators work within those networks, help to build their empowerment to be active and to speak out and lead the community on climate solutions. Work across groups. You may find strange allies in a group or an association that you didn't think was really thinking about climate change. So it's worth the effort to try to locate allies across different groups that we need to work with. The more voices we have, obviously, the more effective we'll be. And again, always incorporate solutions. Another way to look at it, when you're doing public engagement, acknowledge people's emotion. There is a tremendous amount of emotion around these issues, especially as impacts begin to show up at much greater levels than we expected much more quickly. Focus on the local issues, as we've said a number of times. And once again, and another cardinal rule of good communications is repeat, repeat, repeat. Your core message, and mine right here, is emphasize solutions and co-benefits. That can't be done enough in order to bring people along with us in forging climate solutions for our communities. Go to our website. We have American Climate Values, Let's Talk Communities and Climate, a bunch of other reports up there that you might find enjoyable, chock full of research and guidance. And I think at this point, with only a few minutes left, I apologize for going a little long, we can check in with Julia about whether there are any questions that came through. And I want to thank you very much for joining us, and I hope you'll come back in 3 weeks. Thank you very much.
Hey, thanks so much, Dan. Wow, I'm so impressed by how much you were able to fit into that presentation. And we do have some great questions coming in, and definitely want to encourage all of our participants to continue submitting questions. So a question for you. So do you think financial advisors could become a group of leaders who connect with Americans? If they help advise on good choices in, let's say, retirement, they could be guided to make sensible choices in housing. For example, energy efficiency and insulation and HVAC, and along with a number of different areas. So what are your thoughts?
Yes, I think financial advisors can be a tremendously important ally. I'm not a financial expert myself. There was some discussion last week at our annual summit where, you know, how you choose to spend your money is a very, very important choice in daily American life. Financial investors and advisors are realizing that there's a social element to people's money that more and more people are looking to exercise. So there's that angle. Where do you choose to invest? Where do you choose not to invest your money? There are consumer choices that we make every day about specific companies or specific industries that we choose not to support versus those that we do choose to support. For instance, I chose to buy 100% wind power through my local utility, not only because I could, but because I felt it was the right thing to do, even though it cost me a kilowatt hour more, you know, in my bill. I have the ability to do that. Many other people have that ability as well. So I think the financial markets are going to start discovering that what do they call it? Stranded assets of fossil fuels are going to be very difficult to sell to their shareholders. So the more we talk about the financial implications, I think the more we can begin to make informed choices about how we spend our money and how we invest our money.
Fantastic. Thanks, Dan. Another question. The San Francisco Bay Area has largely accepted that climate change is happening. The hard part is accepting the solutions because they negatively affect their way of life. So how do you get people to think beyond their parochial interests?
Well, that really is the proverbial nut to crack. And, you know, it's not surprising that even in a fairly liberal city like San Francisco, it's the same thing here. In Washington, D.C., we've achieved a tremendous amount in terms of putting policies and programs in place for sustainability, yet we still have tremendously bad traffic congestion. Most people aren't using public transportation or walking or biking. And so, you know, I don't have a good answer for this question. It really is probably the biggest unsolved problem is behavior modification, whether it's in an individual's life or in the occupants of a building. And I'll use an example. There's been some research from the U.S. Green Building Council that has shown that even though we are building LEED certified buildings, occupant behavior is the biggest millstone around the neck of building sustainability, so to speak, because people still do not use the technology to its fullest. I think over time, and this is really the big thing we're trying to accomplish, we as a movement and ecoAmerica as a part of it, is that social change, that normative change from, oh, this is a problem that applies to me or not applies to me, to getting to a point where it's like, this is a part of my perspective on myself, my community, and my country, that we are all working together to solve this. Even in a place like San Francisco, that's still a challenge. I think education is important, but I also think that the education and the normative change can't be coming from one sector. It can't just be elected officials. That's why we're trying to equip and empower health leaders, faith leaders, and others to really sort of build the reservoir of change that's needed to get people to start to make choices that they're either just too disengaged or perhaps lazy to make right now.
Great. Thanks, Dan. And another question, many solutions lack an equity component. Lower income residents and communities of color often lose out, particularly with things like gentrification. How do you effectively address equity where everyone can benefit?
Well, you know, I think there's an unfortunate trend where a lot of the big ticket solutions that local jurisdictions and perhaps even associations and membership groups have put in place, they tend to be expensive. So, you know, not that many people in disadvantaged communities can afford to weatherize or retrofit their home or, you know, buy a membership in a car sharing service. So what we've got to do is figure out how those solutions can be applied in those communities in a way that doesn't require the same sort of financial outlay. I mean, I know that that's the case here in Washington, D.C. We are starting to see some significant changes, though, and I'll use an example, and this is purely an observation that I've made recently as we've gone to we've started to include dockless bike sharing systems in Washington, D.C. There are 5 companies that now offer them. Our previous system required an annual membership. It required that you had a credit card. It required that you use the app, so there was a bar to entry to a broad set of participation. My observation, and I have no data to back this up, is that the new method of making our dockless bikes available don't require a membership. They don't require a credit card. They require an app. That's it in some cases. And my observation is that I'm seeing a lot more young people, a lot more African Americans, and people that were not using our docked bike share system that's been around for almost 10 years. So we've managed to figure out a way using technology, the sharing economy, to open up that mode of transportation to a broader audience. When it comes to some of the other big ticket items around infrastructure, those are political choices, and the best possible thing to do is to make sure that as you work with health professionals, faith professionals, their awareness of equity and inequity is part of what you do to get them involved. As spokespeople within and for communities that are disadvantaged, they have a role to play in shaping public policy that will hopefully, and there are probably pretty good examples that I don't know about, hopefully begin to shine a light on providing better equitable solutions across communities.
Thanks so much, Dan. I think we have time for one more question. How do we balance the need to engage new stakeholders and the need to accelerate climate action? And how can you convince other agency staff who are really feeling the urgency of responding to climate change that it's critical that we engage new stakeholders?
Yeah, that again is sort of the central question of the mission of my work right now is, you know, people who are, you know, whether they're sustainability directors or they're elected officials, there are, you know, talking about competing priorities, there are tremendous numbers of competing priorities. The thing that we try to talk with elected leaders and other leaders about is that, you know, the value of spending a little bit of time doing engagement will, as an investment, hopefully bring more voices and more support and more cooperation into the work you're doing as a policymaker or as a community leader. There is, in my experience, a tremendous lack of communications training and engagement training among folks who work in sustainability. I saw that in my organization when I worked in district government. I also saw that there were a lot of people who just didn't even know what we were doing. So I think, again, it's worth the effort and time to try to make your communications and engagement more inclusive, draw unusual voices in so that you get validation and there's a sort of a magnifying effect. And ideally that will not make more work for you, but will help spread the load in terms of shaping public awareness, encouraging participation in events and other opportunities to provide sustainability and energy solutions. There's the old saying, it takes a village. You know, so far, it's really been a lot about environmental, you know, mostly a focus of environmentalists and policymakers to solve climate change. We need to get other village leaders and elders into the conversation, and that will help us share the load. We hope. That's our objective.
Great. Thank you so much, Dan. And that's all the time that we have today for this webinar. I really appreciate you joining us. And this past hour has been incredibly informative. And thank you to everyone who was able to participate. We hope you found this past hour worthwhile and valuable. And as a reminder, the webinar recording and a PDF of Dan's presentation will be shared with everyone by email. We'll also include a registration link for this webinar series. But again, everyone who registered for this webinar is automatically registered for the second one. And we hope that you're able to join us in November. And yeah, thanks again. And this concludes our webinar.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you, everybody.